So smart identification is, I'll come to class notes again. So now smart identification. Smart identification is nothing but it is a second level of recognition mechanism. First level being description properties. So QTP by default tries to recognize the object using description properties, that is, there is no change. In case description properties fails to recognize the object, then second level smart identification is triggered. So only when description property fails to recognize, when I say fail, it can be more than one object, or it can be a description property not matching, that is failure. Whatever be the case, ultimately he is not able to act on that object. In such situations, he looks for whether smart identification is triggered. If it is triggered, he tries to recognize the object using smart identification. Now, smart identification has following ways to recognize the object. One is called base filter properties. All are configurable. You can configure those. Another is optional filter properties. These are all the two available methods for him to recognize the object. Whatever property configured under base filter property has to match. That means if I have three properties, if three properties along with its values has to match in the application under test. Otherwise, smart identification also fails. Under optional filter properties, at least one of the property with value to match the object uniquely. At least one. If I have 10, the combination of these properties, either 10 or 5 or 4 or even 1, to match the application object property, at least one property should be able to identify the object uniquely. If it happens, then he uses that property for the identification. That is optional filter properties. And base filter properties, whatever I configure under base filter properties has to match, and under that base filter properties I need to ensure one minute. Okay, so base filter properties has to match. Optional filter properties, at least one property has to match. This is how smart identification works. So in case of to configure this smart identification, you can do the same through configure button under object identification. So object smart identification can be configured for each class of the object through object identification screen. Fine, I am now I can configure through this. So since object identification is involved, in case smart identification is enabled after the recording, the objects for which smart identification is enabled will not work as it is already recorded without smart identification. This is only in case if you are trying to change after the recording. So to enable smart identification, object class needs to be configured before recording. Thumb rule for enabling the smart identification. I need to do it before I start my recording. I need to configure the object class with the smart identification. For web objects, smart identification is default configured and enabled. Now let us see how do we manage that. I'll go back to quick test. Under this quick test, before I do any recording, what I'm planning to do is, for the same object that we have managed in the previous session, dialog, I want to trigger smart identification. I want to configure smart identification. So again, for configuring smart identification, I'm not trying to use my intelligence. Whatever is there, I'm trying to use those properties. For example, I come to now standard Windows is the add-in under which dialog object is present. For this dialog object, you can see now enable smart identification is not checked. I now check it. You can see now configure is enabled, right hand side. Configure is child window, is own window, native class text. These are all the 4 properties he uses for recording. I am now using the same 4 properties, reconfiguring my smart identification. I now click on configure icon. As I click on configure icon, you can now see that base filter properties is one option available. Second option, optional filter properties. Under this icon, I am now adding the properties for the base filter. For adding the properties, what I am trying to do is, out of the 4 properties that you see in the mandatory properties, I am trying to add native class to the base filter properties. What I am trying to say is, base filter property native class has to match. It can be more than one object as well, but what I feel is native class is an important candidate for me to filter the object. So native class has to match. I choose the native class. I say OK. Once I choose the native class, now I like to configure the optional filter properties. I choose add or remove from optional filter properties. I am choosing the other 3. I know text property fails, so I use now text property as my first candidate in my optional filter properties. You can see now number 1 to the left. Number 1 indicates that first it uses text property to recognize the object. In case text property fails, I am using is child window and is own window as my configuration. I am not using any of my intelligence. Whatever is there in the mandatory, I am trying to configure, because our aim now is to understand smart identification, not trying to understand reason behind what is child window or is own window. So I have selected the three other options that is available mandatory in the optional filter properties. I say OK. Now I configured. Before I move on, you can see a web object. In web objects, you can see by default smart identification is triggered and it is configured. Now you can see a browser there. For browser, there is no mandatory properties, assistive properties. Smart identification, no base filter properties as well. Optional filter properties is configured, pre-configured. There are 9 properties he has configured. At least one of this has to match to identify the browser if there is more than one browser or uniqueness is not available. Image object, you can see this is my mandatory properties. Configure, you can see the other base filter properties and optional filter properties. Default configured. These are all already configured. I don't have to do any other configuration. I cancel it. Now I come back to our standard windows. In standard windows, what we have done for dialog object, we enable the smart identification and we have configured the smart identification. We are saying OK. It is done. Before I record, I'll just open already recorded event for you to understand. I last record is say shared repository. I just open it. In this repository, if you open the same dialog object, flight table is a dialog object, class dialog. You can see below in the description properties right hand side, you can see that enable smart identification is false. I have opened now shared repository. Under shared repository, I have opened the dialog. Flights table is the dialog. Under flights table, I have seen now enable smart identification is false. Even though I configured now, it is not enabled. The reason being, smart identification is part and parcel of identification window. All identification configuration will get reflected to the repository only at the time of new recording. So now I am starting my recording. I am going to record the same event that we have done in the previous session. I select Windows application. I choose flight reservation now. Activated. I'm sorry, there is something happening. There is something. I clear the screen. I come back to flight reservation. I record now. I record. Start my recording. I'm choosing the flights. Now the record is happening after smart identification is configured. I insert order. You can see the order number that is generating. It is 154. That is the order number that is getting generated. Once the order number is generated, I am trying to, it is inserting, it is order number 154. I am faxing that order now. I fax. I have selected file fax. Now I am choosing the fax number, entering the fax number now. So I've entered the fax number. Once the fax number is entered, I click on send fax. Once I send the fax, I clear the screen base state and then I come back to I stop my recording. I've fax is sent. I click on new order, cleared the screen. I stop my order recording. Now, before I run the script, let us understand the repository. How repository is configured for the dialog object. I click on resource. Under resource, I click on now object repository. I choose object repository now. I choose now from resource. I choose now object repository. I choose now object repository. Under this object repository, you can notice now what the fax order number dialog is. How the fax order number dialog is triggered. So if you notice now the fax order number dialog, if you notice now in the smart fax order number dialog, enable smart identification, that is true. So this indicates that at the time of recording, all the configuration values that we have set for dialog object, only for dialog object, is all recorded now. It is, you can see now for flight table as well, you can see that it has been added. Enable smart identification is true. If you for button, you can see that it is not true, it is false. So dialog, since we have configured for dialog object class matching dialog object, the smart identification is true. Now I run the script. I run the script now. So we have configured a smart identification, we have enabled the smart identification, then we did the recording. After recording, I am executing the script now. Script is getting executed. So you can see now the fax order number. He is trying to type now. Initially he generates a failure. Before he sends the failure message, he sees that smart identification is triggered. Using smart identification, he is now typing the fax number, and the same thing for send object. Send object, by default he goes with the description properties. Description property fails to recognize the object. Before he sends the failure, he sees that smart identification is triggered and he identifies the object using smart identification. If you see the result of this automation, last run result, click on result. If I go to the last run result of the last run, you can see that there is an exclamation mark warning, that's an indicator. Under this warning, if I open up each object, you notice now that is under fax order number 154, that is a primary recognition object. He says object was not found and it is supposed to send an error message. and he sees that object identification is invoked, and reason for invoking the object identification, object not found. This was his original description. Using this original description, he is not able to identify the object. Now he triggers the smart identification. Using smart identification, he sees the base filter object native class. There are two objects matching with this class name. Since base native class is matching with this two objects, he goes to the optional filter. In optional filter, he uses text property, and that text property unfortunately fails. Because of that, he skips that property from identification. He goes to each child window. Fortunately, with this property, he is able to manage that object uniquely. One matches, that means it is unique. So native class and this property is enable him to identify the object, so he handles that object. That is the way the smart identification works. Now same thing for the button. So object not identified, then he uses smart identification to identify that object. Later he manages that object, send click is pressed. So this is the way he identifies the object. So it is for accidental purpose we can use smart identification. Smart identification, when the description fails, you can see that it takes time to manage the object. If this description doesn't fail, he manages using description properties itself. So this is about smart identification. I save the file. Any queries? Let me know. The next topic that